The clock on the instrument panel read 10:47 when I keyed in my badge. The reader beeped once, the door clicked, and that was my shift starting. Same as always. I'd been doing this for 3 years. Hatteras Island, NOAA monitoring station, overnight rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. You'd think after 3 years the routine would feel automatic, and it mostly did. But I still ran the checklist the same way every time. Top to bottom, no skipping, no, I'll get it on the way back. That's how things get missed. I'd seen guys skip steps and spend the rest of the shift chasing a number that turned out to be a loose connector they walked past an hour earlier. Not worth it. So I started at the instrument room, same as always. The barometric pressure sensor was reading 29.84, which was normal for November on the Outer Banks. Wind gauge was functional, pulling northeast at around 9 knots. The humidity logger had a sticky display. It had been doing that for 2 weeks. I'd already put in a ticket, but the underlying data was transmitting fine. I tapped it twice, and the number unstuck. I wrote it down. The ceiling height estimate from the ceilometer matched what I'd pulled off the regional forecast before I left my apartment, which was a good sign. When those two numbers are way off from each other, that's usually the first thing that tells you something's actually happening. The radio uplink was green. The satellite link was green. The NOAA data relay was green. I initialed each line on the equipment log and moved on. The main instrument room takes maybe 15 minutes if you're being thorough. After that, the checklist moves you downstairs to the antenna array and the lower deck systems, and then back up and out to the catwalks. I always did the catwalks last because they're cold, and I didn't see the point in being cold any longer than necessary. It was November. The wind off Pamlico Sound has a specific kind of bite to it that I can only describe as personal, like it's specifically annoyed at you. The lower deck was fine. Antenna array was fine. The bilge access hatch was sealed, and the indicator light was green, which I noted and moved on from. I didn't think about that hatch again for a while. The south catwalk was fine. The anemometer mount was solid, no corrosion on the fittings. The casing on the wind direction sensor was intact. I did find a loose bolt on the railing bracket near the south end, which I tightened with the 1/4 inch I keep in my jacket pocket. I wrote it down anyway so maintenance had a record. That's the job. Then I went to the north catwalk. The Federal Signal Model 2 is mounted to the north railing, which I'd always thought was a weird place for it. The south catwalk faces the sound, and the north faces the beach and the shoals, and if you're warning boat traffic, you'd think you'd want it facing the water. But I didn't install it, and I wasn't going to move it, so it lives on the north catwalk. It's a big unit, gray housing, about the size of a carry-on suitcase mounted sideways, with the horn facing out over the railing and the motor drive housing on the back. The hand crank is folded flat against the side when the motor's running it. You'd only use the crank if the motor went out. I ran the standard test, keyed the activation sequence on the panel, waited for the motor drive to spin up. Nothing. I tried it again. The panel acknowledged the command. The motor drive did not respond. I could hear the relay clicking, which meant the signal was getting there, but the motor itself wasn't turning. I pulled the housing cover and looked at it, which I probably shouldn't have done without a maintenance tech present, but I just wanted to confirm what I already suspected. The drive was dead. The brushes were worn down to almost nothing, and one of the lead wires had pulled loose from the terminal. Not a quick fix. I wrote it up in the log. Federal Signal Model 2, North Catwalk, motor drive failure, inoperable. Flagged for maintenance. Unit functional on manual hand crank only. I initialed it and moved on. It was a minor note. Equipment fails on coastal installations all the time. The salt air eats everything eventually. I figured maintenance would get to it in a day or two. I didn't think about it again. Johnny showed up at 11:27. I know the exact time because I was updating the hourly log entry when the door beeped, and I looked up at the panel clock out of habit. 11:27. He was supposed to clock in at 10:45, which put him 42 minutes late. I wrote that down too. He came in with his jacket half unzipped and his keys still in his hand, which meant he'd been in a hurry somewhere and had stopped being in a hurry by the time he got to the door. He smelled like bourbon. Not overwhelming, but present. The kind of smell that's had a couple hours to settle into someone's jacket. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door and dropped into his chair. Didn't explain the time. Didn't offer anything. Johnny Barker had been working coastal monitoring stations since before I finished high school, and he operated on the assumption that his presence was sufficient, timing optional. I want to be clear that I liked Johnny. Liked. He was blunt and occasionally insufferable, and he had a habit of explaining things to me that I already knew, but he genuinely knew what he was talking about, especially with the buoy systems. 20 years of watching marine data will do that. I trusted his read on the equipment in a way I didn't trust most people's. I looked at the log entry. 11:27. 42 minutes late. I thought about calling it in. I had the duty officer number in my phone. I had the protocol. I knew what the form looked like. One call, one report, and it goes in his file. He'd been written up before, I was pretty sure, though I didn't know the specifics. Another one might actually do something. But it was one bad night, and 20 years is 20 years. I closed the log and didn't pick up my phone. That felt like mercy at the time. I've thought about it since. Johnny pulled up the Diamond Shoals buoy data without being asked, which was actually the one part of the job he was always prompt about. He had the display up inside 3 minutes of sitting down, scrolling through the station list, pulling readings. I was still finishing my catwalk notes. He went quiet for a minute. I noticed the quiet, but didn't look up right away. "Hey," he said again. "Yeah. Come look at this." I walked over. He had buoy 411025 pulled up on the main display, Diamond Shoals, about 14 miles southeast of the station, sitting in some of the most consistently rough water on the east coast. The shoals have been sinking ships since before anyone was keeping records. The buoy there matters. The data on the screen was wrong. Not wrong like corrupted or missing. Wrong in a specific, strange way. The last 4 readings were identical. Not close. Not within rounding error. Identical. Same wave height. Same water temperature. Same barometric pressure. Same wind speed. Down to the decimal. Timestamp 9 p.m. 9:15, 9:30, 9:45. 4 readings, same numbers, repeating. "How long has it been doing that?" I asked. "Since 9, he said. "That's 4 readings. Could be more if it started before 9, but that's as far back as the display goes without pulling the archive." I looked at it. "Sensor failure." Johnny shook his head. "Sensors fail, they go quiet or they send garbage. Random values, nulls, error codes, they don't lock." He tapped the screen. "This is locked. Something is holding these 4 values and transmitting them on schedule like everything's normal. So the transmitter's working, but the sensors aren't updating." "Transmitter's working," he said. "Whether the sensors are updating is a different question. Something upstream of the transmission is stuck." I stood there looking at the 4 identical rows of numbers. He was right that it was strange. I'd seen buoy malfunctions before, we all had. And they usually looked like noise. Random spikes, dropped packets, a sensor going to 0 and staying there. This didn't look like noise. It looked deliberate, which was the wrong word for a piece of equipment, but it was the word that came to mind. "I'm going to call Norfolk," I said. Johnny shrugged, which was his way of saying he thought it was probably unnecessary but wasn't going to stop me. I was already reaching for the phone. The Marine Operations Center in Norfolk has a direct line for weather station reports. I've called it maybe a dozen times over 3 years. Equipment flags, data anomalies, the occasional bird strike that knocked a sensor loose. It's not a dramatic call to make. You give them your station ID, describe the issue, they log it and either escalate or don't. Usually they don't. Usually you get a case number and a "will follow up in the morning," and that's the end of it. I dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Marine Operations Center, this is Hughes." The voice was flat. Not unfriendly, just the voice of someone who'd answered the same phone the same way probably 1,000 times. "This is Turner, Hatteras Island Station, ID Delta 7904. I'm reporting a data anomaly on buoy 41025, Diamond Shoals." I heard him typing, slow, steady keystrokes. "Nature of the anomaly? Locked transmission loop. 4 readings, identical, cycling on schedule since approximately 2100. The transmitter's functioning, but the data hasn't updated in over 2 hours. It doesn't match any failure pattern I've seen. No noise, no nulls, just the same 4 values repeating." More typing. A pause. "Copy that. I'm assigning case number November 447 Romeo. We'll have a technician review the archive data during the day shift." "Understood." I wrote the case number on the corner of the log sheet. "Is there any prior record of this buoy flagging anomalous behavior? Anything in the system?" A pause. Longer than the typing pauses. "I'm not seeing anything in the active file," he said, which wasn't quite the same as no. I noticed that. "Okay," I said. "I'll keep monitoring and note any changes in the shift log." I was about to thank him and hang up. Standard close. The whole call had taken maybe 90 seconds, and I was already thinking about the next item on the check rotation. Then he said, "Turner. Yeah, don't open the lower deck hatch tonight." I didn't say anything for a second. The lower deck hatch. The bilge access panel on the underside of the station, down the interior stairs, past the antenna junction box. I'd opened it maybe twice in 3 years. It wasn't a hatch you opened unless you had a reason. "Can you?" I started. The line was dead. Not a dropped call, not static cutting out, just gone, mid-sentence, like he'd set the receiver down on the cradle the moment he finished talking. I stood there with the phone against my ear for a second before I accepted that there was nobody on the other end. I called back. 4 rings, then a recorded message. "You have reached the NOAA Marine Operations Center. Our office hours are..." I hung up and called again. Same thing. That was it. A case number and 4 words I hadn't asked for, and then nothing. I set the phone down and looked at the case number I'd written on the log sheet. November 447 Romeo. I wrote it again in the main log under the buoy entry with the timestamp and Hughes's name. Proper documentation. That's me. The station's on fire. I'm still filling in the right fields. The thing was, duty officers don't volunteer information. That's not how those calls work. You report, they log, they assign a number. If there's something else you need to know, you ask a specific question and they either answer it or they tell you it's outside their scope. They don't just add things. They especially don't add things like, "Don't open the lower deck hatch tonight," with no context, and then hang up before you can ask a single follow-up question. I figured either Hughes had the wrong station, or there was something in the file he wasn't supposed to tell me, or he was having some kind of night. I didn't have a 4th option that made more sense than those 3. Johnny was leaning against the far console with his arms crossed, watching me. "What did they say?" "Case number. Day shift will review the buoy archive." I paused. "And the duty officer told me not to open the lower deck hatch tonight." Johnny looked at me. "He just said that." "Yeah, unprompted, then the line went dead." Johnny was quiet for a second, which I appreciated. Then he uncrossed his arms and said, "Duty officers say weird stuff sometimes. Probably a miscommunication. Wrong station, or he was reading off the wrong screen. Maybe. You get a name? Hughes, Mario Hughes?" He shrugged. "I don't know a Hughes. Could be new." He pushed off from the console. "I'm going to go check the antenna array. The flood lamps on the south side were flickering when I came in." Might be a relay issue. I'll keep monitoring from up here. He grabbed his radio off the charger and clipped it to his jacket. Didn't say anything else. Just headed for the interior stairs and went down. And then I was alone on the upper deck. The station makes a particular kind of quiet at night. The instruments hum. The wind moves around the exterior. You can hear the surf if it's loud enough, which it usually is, a low constant underneath everything else. It's not silent, but it's a specific texture of sound that I know well enough that I stop hearing it after the first hour. That night it felt quieter than that. I noticed it and couldn't explain it. The instruments were still humming. The wind was still there. But something in the mix was off. Or maybe something was missing from it and I couldn't identify what. I looked at the case number on the log sheet. November 447, Romeo. I thought about calling Norfolk back a third time. I didn't. There wasn't anything else to say to them, and whoever answered, if anyone answered, wasn't going to be Hughes. I pulled up the buoy display again. 41025 was still transmitting. Still the same 4 readings, still cycling on schedule. I watched it for a minute. Then I pulled up the adjacent buoys to compare. All normal. Random variation, sensors updating, the usual texture of live data. 41025 sat in the middle of all that, like a held breath. The radio on the console crackled. Johnny's voice came through. "Turner." I picked it up. "Go ahead. The exterior flood lamps are out." A pause. All of them. I checked the lamp control panel. The status indicators were all showing green, which meant the system thought the lamps were on. "Panel's reading nominal up here. They're not on," he said, and I'm standing on the lower deck looking at the beach and it's dark. I looked at the camera controls. We had a weather camera mounted on the east-facing exterior, mainly for cloud cover documentation, but it covered the beach approach. I pulled up the feed on the secondary monitor. The image was dark, not black. There was enough ambient light from somewhere, maybe the overcast sky, maybe distant light off the water, that I could see the beach below the station. The pylons, the surf line, and the figures. They were pale, roughly human in shape and proportion. There were a lot of them. They were arranged in rows across the beach, evenly spaced, all of them oriented toward the station pylons. Prone, flat on the sand. Johnny's voice came through the radio again, quieter this time. "You seeing this on the camera?" "Yeah," I said. "What are they?" "I don't know." I kept watching the feed. The figures didn't move. They just lay there in their rows, facing the pylons, and I counted maybe 30 before I stopped counting because the number wasn't the point. Then every single one of them stood up, not one at a time, not a ripple moving through the group, all of them simultaneously, in one motion, rising from prone to standing like the same signal had passed through all of them at once. They were upright and still and facing the station, and the camera feed just sat there showing me that, and I didn't say anything on the radio, and Johnny didn't say anything either. The camera feed was still running. I kept my eyes on it. They were standing now, all of them, and I was trying to get a better look because the image quality on that monitor was never great. It was a Pelco unit, older, and the low-light mode washed things out a little. But there was enough to see that they were pale in a way that wasn't just the camera. Pale the way something gets when it's been in the water a long time. Roughly human-shaped, roughly human proportioned, but something about the way they were standing was slightly off. Not dramatic, just off. Like the weight distribution was wrong, like they'd learned standing from a description of it. I zoomed in on the feed. The station camera had a manual digital zoom and it was bad, pixelated, blocky, but I got it close enough. The faces. Every single face was the same. Slack jaw, hanging open just slightly. Eyes that were milky, not white exactly, more like the color of old plastic left in the sun. And from the chin up, running along the jaw, up the cheeks, to the hairline. Barnacle crust. Dense, irregular, grayish, not scattered, covering, like something that had grown there over time and been allowed to keep going. I sat with that for a second. That was the thing I was looking at. Okay. I zoomed out a little because looking at one face, that close was enough. And when I did, I could see that it wasn't just similar faces. It was the same face, repeated. Every single figure on that beach had the same slack jaw, the same milky eyes, the same crust, and the same distribution. 30-something of them, or however many I'd stopped counting, and not one variation. That part bugged me more than I expected it to. Johnny still hadn't said anything on the radio. I was about to key it when something on the feed caught my eye. One of the figures in the second row, slightly left of center. It was wearing something on its chest. A lanyard. I zoomed in again, blocky and bad, but I could make out a badge hanging from it. A rectangular badge with a photo and a logo at the top. No A logo. Blue and white. A contractor badge. I stared at the feed for probably 10 seconds, trying to decide if I was reading it right. The image was bad, but the badge shape was right. The lanyard color was right. Yellow, no AA contractor standard. And the logo at the top was the right shape. And the photo on the badge. I couldn't make out the face on the badge clearly. Not at that resolution, but I could see enough. Enough to recognize the general features. Enough to know I'd seen that photo before. I knew that badge. I didn't know from where immediately. I just knew I'd seen it. That specific photo, that specific face. It was the kind of thing that sits in your peripheral memory. Something you've looked at enough times that it registers without you filing it anywhere deliberately. I pulled back from the monitor and stood up. The overnight technician. That was it. I'd seen that badge in the equipment closet, clipped to the shift handoff board, the way contractors always left them when they came through for maintenance rotations. I'd glanced at it a dozen times without really looking, but I'd looked enough. I needed to know who that was and where they were supposed to be. The equipment closet was at the back of the main operations room, past the instrument rack and the secondary comms panel, standard station layout. I'd been in it 100 times. I walked back there and I was moving faster than I usually do, not running, just not taking my time. The closet had a contact sheet on the inside of the door. Standard no AA contractor protocol, laminated sheet with names, badge numbers, emergency contacts, scheduled rotation dates. If that badge belonged to whoever was on overnight rotation, their information would be right there. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door didn't open. I pulled again, harder, thinking it had just stuck. The humidity on Hatteras does things to door frames. They swell. It happens. But it wasn't stuck. It was locked, deadbolted. I stood there for a second. The deadbolt on that door was a single cylinder unit, the kind where the thumb turn is on the inside and the keyhole is on the outside. Standard interior closet hardware, which meant the deadbolt could only be turned from inside the closet. I checked it again, tried the handle again, deadbolted, from the inside. That was not possible if the closet was empty. I went to the key cabinet on the wall next to the secondary comms panel. We had an override key for the equipment closet, a physical key that worked the exterior cylinder for exactly this kind of situation, which was supposed to be a situation like someone accidentally locked themselves in, not whatever this was. The key was on its hook. I grabbed it, went back to the closet, and unlocked it. I opened the door. The smell hit me first. Salt water and something else I don't have a clean word for. Not rot exactly. Closer to low tide, but concentrated. The closet was maybe 8 feet deep, lined with metal shelving on both sides, battery racks on the left, spare equipment and supply bins on the right. The overhead fluorescent was off. The light from the operations room came in behind me and lit enough of it. Alvin Wallace was wedged behind the backup battery rack on the left side, sitting, kind of, with his back against the wall and his knees up. He was in standard contractor work clothes. His head was tilted back slightly. I could see his ears from where I was standing, and both of them had bled, dried dark both sides, the kind of bleed that comes from inside. Both eardrums, ruptured. I didn't go closer right away. I just stood in the doorway and looked. His face was still. Not the slack-jaw thing from the beach. Just still. Whatever had happened to him, it had been a while ago. Then I looked at the shelving above him. The metal shelf bracket, the one right above where he was sitting. The paint was gone. Not scratched off in a general way. Worn down in one specific spot, a patch maybe 4 inches wide. Worn all the way to bare metal and then into the metal itself. Shallow gouges in the same place over and over. I stepped in far enough to see it clearly. "Open!" Scratched into the shelf. The same word, written dozens of times in the same spot, layered over itself until the earlier ones were just texture under the later ones. The letters were small and irregular, done with a fingernail, done over a long time. I stood there looking at that for a while. Alvin Wallace had locked himself in here. That was the only explanation that fit. He'd come in, turned the deadbolt from the inside, wedged himself behind the battery rack, and stayed. And at some point he'd started writing that word on the shelf above him, over and over, until he couldn't anymore. The things on the beach. They'd been inside the station before my shift started. Before I clocked in at 10:47. Before Johnny showed up smelling like bourbon. Before any of tonight. Alvin Wallace had known that, and he'd locked himself in the one room with a bolt that only worked from the inside. And he'd stayed there. And he'd written "open" into the metal above his head until his fingers gave out. I looked at the shelf above him again. Not just at the word. There was a notebook sitting on it. The notebook wasn't thick. That was the first thing I noticed. Maybe 60 pages. The spiral-bound kind with the black cardboard cover. The ones you can get at any drugstore for $2. It was sitting flat on the shelf, spine out, like he'd set it there carefully. Not thrown, not dropped. Set. I reached past the scratched-out "open" and picked it up. The cover had A. Wallace, field notes, written on it in marker. Neat handwriting, the kind of person who labels things. I opened it. The first few pages were standard station log stuff, equipment checks, calibration notes, buoy signal quality ratings, dates going back almost a year. November of last year, December, January. All formatted the same way, all in the same pen, all in that same neat handwriting. I almost skipped ahead. Then I hit the margin notes. They started in January. Small, written sideways in the margins of a regular calibration entry, like he'd added them after the fact and run out of room. The handwriting was the same, but tighter, more careful. Jan. 9/0214, HR's buoy 41025, camera capture. 4 subjects, prone, approximately 30 meters east of pylon base, barnacle growth, chin to hairline. Did not surface. Retreated before 300. That was it. Just that. No, what the hell, or I can't believe what I'm seeing. Just a log entry, 4 subjects, barnacle growth, retreated before 0300. The way you'd write wind shifted northeast or pressure dropping 2 millibars. I kept reading. February had 6 entries. March had 9. The format never changed. Date, time, buoy designation, number of subjects, behavior, duration, outcome. Every single one. He'd been doing this since January, and writing it in the margins of his regular logs because, I don't know, maybe he didn't have anywhere else to put it. Maybe he didn't want it in the official record until he had authorization to put it there. That word again. Authorization. I flipped through faster. The entries got more detailed as the months went on. He started adding notes about positioning, whether they were prone or standing, how they moved, what direction they retreated. He noted which buoy cameras had the best angle. He cross-referenced multiple buoys on the same night when more than one had a sighting. By April, he was logging response behaviors. What made them stop? What made them move? That's where the frequency table started. It was on a page by itself, hand-copied onto graph paper that he'd folded and tucked into the binding. He'd unfolded it and taped it flat to the page at some point. The tape was yellowed. He'd been referencing this for a while. The table had 3 columns: frequency in hertz, duration of exposure, observed response. He'd tested different things, or documented different things. I wasn't sure which. Some of the entries were marked incidental, meaning he'd caught the response on camera without having caused it. A boat horn at around 200 hertz, a foghorn at somewhere in the low 300s, a marine radio burst that he'd clocked at 340. Each one had a response column. Partial agitation. No response. Mild agitation. Brief. Then there was a line about 2/3 down the page. It was in different ink, darker. He'd gone over it more than once. 360 hertz, sustained. Federal signal Model 2, full convulsion and retreat. All subjects, immediate onset. Repeated. Same result. Repeated again. Same result. I read that 3 times. 360 hertz, sustained tone. Federal signal Model 2. The Federal signal Model 2 was mounted to the north catwalk railing. I'd logged it at the start of my shift. Motor drive dead, hand crank only. I'd flagged it for maintenance and moved on. I stood there in the equipment closet holding that notebook, and I didn't say anything, because there was nobody to say anything to. Johnny wasn't answering his radio. Alvin Wallace was wedged behind the battery rack with his eardrums ruptured. There was just me and the notebook and the smell of salt and copper and the hum of the backup batteries. The motor drive was dead. The siren was sitting on the north catwalk railing and the motor drive was dead, and I'd flagged it for maintenance, and that was it. I'd written hand crank only in the log and moved on. I kept reading. The last 10 pages of the notebook were harder to get through. Not because the handwriting changed. It didn't. It stayed neat and careful all the way to the end. But because of what he was writing. He documented everything. He had the frequency. He had the countermeasure. He had 11 months of evidence that it worked, every single time, no exceptions. And the last entries were about authorization. May 15th. Submitted incident report to station supervisor, awaiting response. June 3rd. Followed up on May 15th report. No response on record. Resubmitted. June 29th. Escalated to regional office. Advised to route through standard maintenance and anomaly reporting channels. July, August, September. More submissions, more follow-ups, more routing to different offices. He'd tried the Marine Operations Center. He'd tried the regional anomaly desk. He'd tried 3 different supervisors. Every entry was the same tone. Factual, patient, procedural. No frustration in the writing, just the facts. Date, action taken, response received. October 14th was the last dated entry. No authorization received to date. Continuing to document. Will not act without authorization. That was it. That was the last thing he wrote in the dated entries. After that, there were 2 pages of undated notes. Shorter. The handwriting was the same, but the sentences were choppier, like he was writing faster, or his hands were cold. He documented 2 more encounters. He'd noted that the figures had been seen on the station camera, not just the buoys. Interior proximity, he'd written. He'd noted that he'd locked himself in the equipment closet. He'd noted that the Federal Signal Model 2 hand crank was operational and accessible from the north catwalk. The last line on the last page said, "Awaiting authorization to proceed." I closed the notebook. Alvin Wallace had the answer for 11 months. He'd documented it carefully and completely, and he'd tried to hand it to someone, a lot of someones, and nobody had taken it. And he'd locked himself in this closet and waited, because he wasn't going to act without authorization, and the authorization was never going to come. I looked down at him. He didn't look peaceful or anything like that. He just looked like a man who'd been behind a battery rack for a long time. The siren, the north catwalk, the hand crank I'd noted in my log at the start of my shift like it was a minor inconvenience. A maintenance flag. Something for the next guy to deal with. 360 hertz, sustained. Full convulsion and retreat. All subjects, immediate onset. I knew why the motor drive was dead. I didn't know how I knew exactly. It wasn't in the notebook, just a feeling that had settled in while I was reading. Something had burned it out. Too many sustained cycles, maybe, or something had gotten to it before Alvin ever had the chance to use it. Didn't matter. The crank was there. The crank worked. I'd put my hand on it myself during the equipment check and noted it was functional before I moved on. The question was already forming before I'd even fully thought it through. Alvin had the answer, and he'd waited for someone to tell him he was allowed to use it. He'd filed reports. He'd followed up. He'd escalated through the right channels in the right order, and he'd written, awaiting authorization to proceed, on the last page of his notebook, and then he died behind a battery rack with open, scratched into the shelf above his head. I thought about Mario Hughes at the Marine Operations Center, the case number he'd given me. Don't open the lower deck hatch. The line going dead. 2 callbacks with no answer. I thought about Johnny not answering his radio. I stood there in the equipment closet with the notebook in my hand and the backup batteries humming and Alvin Wallace on the floor. And I thought about what authorization actually meant at 2-something in the morning on a barrier island with the beach full of those things and the lower deck hatch making sounds I didn't want to think about too hard. Alvin had believed in the chain of command. I understood that. I'm not knocking it. I'd made the same call 3 hours ago when I decided not to report Johnny for showing up drunk, except that was me protecting someone, and this was different. This was Alvin protecting a process, trusting that if he did everything right, someone up the chain would eventually look at his 11 months of documented evidence and say, yes, go ahead, use the siren. Nobody had said yes. I flipped back to the frequency table, found the line he'd gone over twice in darker ink, 360 hertz, sustained, Federal Signal Model 2, full convulsion and retreat, all subjects, immediate onset. I stood in the equipment closet for another minute after I found the frequency table entry. Just stood there. The backup batteries were humming that low, steady hum they always do, and Alvin was on the floor and I had the notebook in my hand with the answer written right there in darker ink than everything else around it. 360 hertz, sustained, Federal Signal Model 2, full convulsion and retreat. The siren with the dead motor drive, the one I'd flagged hand crank only at 10:47, and then completely stopped thinking about. I closed the notebook and put it under my arm and stepped back out into the main floor. Pulled the equipment closet door shut behind me. I didn't lock it. Felt wrong to lock it with Alvin in there, which I know doesn't make any sense, but that's where I was at. The camera feed was still up on the monitor. The figures were still on the beach. Same rows, same orientation, same slack faces pointed at the pylons. I counted them again out of habit. Still 20-something. I'd stopped getting an exact number because they kept being in slightly different positions every time I looked, and I couldn't tell if that was camera compression or something else. I stopped counting. I tried Johnny on the radio. Standard channel. Johnny, come in. Turner here. Nothing. Static and the hiss of the wind off the sound. I tried again. Johnny, radio check, come in. Still nothing. I set the radio down on the console and looked at the clock. Just past 1. The hatch sound started maybe 10 minutes after that. It was coming from the lower deck, wet and sustained, like something working at a seal from the other side. Not a knock, not a bang. More like pressure. Applied, slow, rhythmic, patient. The bilge access hatch, which I'd never had a reason to think about before that night, was apparently right below the main floor grate, because I could feel it more than hear it at first. A vibration in the soles of my boots. Then it got louder. I tried Johnny again. Nothing. I pulled up the lower deck camera, but the exterior flood lamps were still out and the interior angle was bad. I could see the base of the antenna housing and part of the equipment rack and a strip of the floor near the bilge hatch, and that was it. The hatch looked closed. Whatever was working at it was working at it from underneath. I kept the radio in my hand, kept trying, every couple of minutes. "Johnny, come in." "Barker, radio check." "Johnny, if you can hear this, key twice." Nothing. At some point I realized I was standing on the floor grate, and I took one step to the left and stood on solid decking instead. That felt better. A little. Then I heard him. It was coming up through the grate. His voice, muffled by the deck but recognizable. That flat, slightly slurred cadence I'd been listening to for 3 years. He was saying something. One word, over and over. I couldn't make it out. I pressed the sole of my boot against the edge of the grate and leaned, and I still couldn't make it out. Just the shape of it. One syllable. Maybe two. Repeated at the same interval. Getting quieter each time, like he was moving away, or like whatever was producing the sound was running down. I tried the radio again. He didn't answer the radio. I stood there and listened to the word I couldn't hear getting smaller, and then I couldn't hear it anymore. And the station went quiet except for the cracking from the bilge hatch and the hum of the batteries in the wind. I sat down on the floor with my back against the console and the notebook in my lap, and I waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe I thought he'd come back on the radio. Maybe I thought I'd hear him on the stairs. I'm not sure I was thinking in a straight line by that point. I read the frequency table entry again. Then I read the 3 entries before it, which were all the same. Different dates, same outcome. 360 hertz, sustained, full retreat. Alvin had written immediate onset and underlined it once. The cracking from below stopped somewhere around 2. The station was very quiet after that. Just the wind and the instruments and the low-grade hum of everything electrical doing what it was supposed to do. I checked the beach camera. The figures hadn't moved. Same rows, same faces. I looked at the clock. 2:14. I heard the stairwell door. It wasn't loud. It was actually pretty quiet. The door at the base of the interior stairs has a specific sound. A soft catch and then a creak on the second step that I'd been meaning to log for a month. I heard the catch. I heard the creak. I stood up. Johnny came into view at the base of the stairwell. He was standing, upright, weight distributed, both feet on the floor. He looked like Johnny. Same jacket, same build, same thinning hair. He was looking in my direction. His jaw was slack, not relaxed, slack. Like the hinge wasn't working right, and starting at his chin, running up toward his cheekbones. There was a texture I recognized from the camera feed. Still early, still spreading, but there. I didn't say anything. I don't know what I would have said. He started walking toward the stairs. Slow, not unsteady, just slow. His mouth was moving. I could see it moving from where I was standing, and I watched it as hard as I could, and I could not read what it was forming. Maybe something. Maybe nothing. Maybe the same word I'd heard through the grate still running down. I don't know. I was still watching his mouth when the fire alarm went off. It came from the lower deck. The station's alarm is a federal signal too, actually. Different model, but same family. And it is loud in a way that takes up all the available space in your head the second it starts. One moment I was watching Johnny's mouth. The next moment there was nothing but the alarm and the red pulse of the indicator light on the panel behind me. I looked at his mouth, still moving. I couldn't read it. I couldn't hear anything. The alarm was a wall. I looked at him for another second, trying to find something, some flicker. Some recognition in the eyes that were pointed at me from the bottom of the stairs. I didn't find it, or I couldn't tell. That's the honest answer. I couldn't tell. The notebook was in my hand. The siren was on the north catwalk. Nobody was going to call back and tell me it was okay to go use it. I turned and went for the catwalk hatch. The catwalk hatch opened outward, and the wind hit me immediately. cold, salt-heavy, coming off the Sound. November on Hatteras has a particular kind of cold that gets into your collar and stays there. I noted it the way you note anything when your brain is running on procedure. Filed it, moved on. The Federal Signal Model 2 was right where it always was. Mounted to the north railing, bracket bolted through the grate, hand crank on the right side. I'd walked past it 100 times on shift checks, never actually touched the crank. The motor drive was the whole point. You flipped a switch and it ran. The motor was dead. That was the whole problem. And also, as it turned out, the whole solution. I grabbed the mounting bracket with my left hand first because the crank was on the right and I needed something to brace against. The bracket was cold, painted steel, slightly rough where the paint had chipped at the edges. I got my grip and reached across with my right hand and found the crank handle. It was smaller than I expected, about the size of a door handle, nothing dramatic about it. I started turning. The first rotation was stiff. The mechanism hadn't been manually operated in, I don't know, probably years, maybe longer. It ground a little, caught, then released into something smoother. The second rotation was easier. By the third, the tone had started building, that low, sustained note climbing out of the horn assembly and going out over the railing, over the beach, over the surf. 360 hertz. I know what that sounds like now. I knew it then because Alvin's notebook had a page with the frequency written out and underlined twice, and I'd been staring at that page for the better part of an hour. It's not a pleasant sound. It's not supposed to be. It's a warning tone, designed to carry distance, designed to cut through wind and ambient noise and the general indifference of the atmosphere. It does that. It carried. I looked down at the beach. Every single figure convulsed at the same time. Not one, then another. All of them, simultaneously. Like something had passed through the whole group at once. A current, or a signal, or whatever the right word is for what happens when 100 things respond to the same input in the same instant. Their bodies went rigid, then folded wrong, then straightened again. The ones in the front rows stumbled backward into the ones behind them. It didn't look like pain exactly. I don't know what it looked like. Something involuntary, something they weren't doing on purpose. And then they started moving back toward the water. Slow at first, then faster. Not running, nothing that coordinated, but moving with direction, all of them oriented toward the surf line. The rows collapsing into a mass, moving away from the pylons. Away from the station, away from the siren. I kept cranking. My right arm was doing the actual work. My left hand was just holding the bracket, keeping me braced against the railing while the crank pulled at my shoulder and the wind pushed from the other side. The grate under my feet was solid. For the first minute, it was solid. Then I felt the first bolt go. It didn't break. It pulled. The bracket mount on the northeast corner shifted maybe half an inch and the grate flexed under my right foot. I looked down. The bolt was still there, but the metal around it had deformed slightly, the grate pulling away from the mount on one side. I shifted my weight left and kept turning. The second bolt went about 30 seconds later. Same side, different corner. The grate tilted maybe 5 degrees and then caught on something. Another bracket, I think, further along the railing. And held. But it wasn't flat anymore. It was angled. I was standing on an angled surface with the wind coming off the Sound, and 100 pale figures on the beach below me retreating toward the water, and I was still turning the crank. I want to be clear that I was not calm about this. I was functioning, which is a different thing. My hands were doing what they needed to do. The rest of me was somewhere else, running on something that wasn't exactly thought. The figures were maybe halfway to the surf line when my shoulder went. 3rd minute. I know it was the 3rd minute because I'd been counting rotations without meaning to. Something my brain was doing on its own, keeping track of something. And I was somewhere around 150 rotations when the joint dislocated. I felt it before I heard it, which is an interesting order of events. There was a sensation of wrongness, of something moving in a direction it wasn't built for, and then a sound I'm not going to describe. and then my left arm stopped working. It didn't hurt right away. That's the thing about dislocations. There's a window. A few seconds where your body is still processing what happened, and the pain signal is still in transit. I used that window. I shifted my grip. Left hand off the bracket, right hand still on the crank. I got my right forearm hooked around the bracket instead, inside of my elbow over the top of the painted steel body weight leaning into it, and I kept turning. The crank was on the right side. My right hand was still on the crank. My left arm was hanging at a wrong angle, and I was not looking at it. The pain arrived. I noted it and kept turning. The grate shifted again under my feet, a longer movement this time, and I widened my stance and leaned harder into the bracket, and the tone kept going out across the beach, 360 hertz, steady and sustained, and the figures were still moving. I could see Johnny. He was near the back of the group, or what had been the back before they all started moving, still upright, still moving the way he'd been moving when I last saw him at the bottom of the stairs, that particular gait that wasn't quite right. That wasn't how Johnny Barker walked when he was Johnny Barker. He was moving with the rest of them now, toward the surf. His arms were still reaching, that same gesture, even as he walked away from the station. I watched him reach the surf line. The water took the front rows first. They didn't stop at the edge. They walked in. The surf came up to their knees, their waists, and they kept going, and the ones behind them followed. Johnny was in the middle of it, still reaching, still moving. The water came up to his chest, and then his shoulders, and then he was gone. I kept cranking until the last figure went under. Then I kept cranking a little longer because I didn't trust the last figure going under. When I finally stopped, the beach was empty. Just wet sand and surf and the dark water and the wind. Nothing else. I stood there on the tilted grate with my right forearm still hooked around the bracket and my left arm hanging at the wrong angle and the siren going quiet, the tone dropping off slowly as the mechanism wound down. And I looked at the beach for a long time. The fire alarm was still going below me. I could feel it through the station structure, that low transmitted vibration even with the siren dying out. Red light still pulsing somewhere through the catwalk hatch. The beach was empty. I checked it again, sector by sector, the way you check an instrument panel, north to south, surf line to pylons, nothing, just sand. That was it. They were gone. Getting back through the hatch was harder than I expected. My right arm worked fine. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that I'd been bracing against the bracket so long that my right hand had kind of locked around it, and when I finally let go, my fingers didn't want to cooperate right away. I had to shake them out one at a time, watching them like they belonged to someone else. The left arm I just held against my body. I'd figured out pretty quick that moving it at all was a bad idea. The catwalk grate was tilted maybe 15 degrees off where it started. 3 of the 4 bracket bolts had pulled loose from the railing mount during the last few minutes of cranking. It held, but I didn't love standing on it. I got myself turned around, got my right hand on the hatch frame, and sort of lowered myself back through into the station. My left arm swung when I dropped down, and I made a sound I'm not going to describe. Then I was inside. I sat down on the floor, right there, next to the hatch. Didn't make it to a chair. The floor was fine. It was a non-slip composite surface, standard NOAA station issue, and it was cold and solid and exactly where I needed to be. The fire alarm had stopped at some point. I wasn't sure when. Sometime in the last few minutes of cranking, probably. I'd stopped registering it. The station was quiet now. Just the wind against the structure and the low background hum of the instrument array, and somewhere below me, the sound of water moving under the pylons. Normal sounds, station sounds. I sat there and listened to them for a while. My left arm was useless. That was the clinical way to put it. The shoulder had gone wrong somewhere in the 3rd minute of cranking. I'd felt it go, and then I'd shifted my grip and kept going because There wasn't a version of stopping that made sense. Now, the joint was sitting at an angle that didn't match how joints were supposed to sit, and the whole arm from shoulder to fingertip was this dull, insistent wrong. Not sharp, just constant. I kept it pressed against my side and didn't look at it. The sky outside the east-facing windows was changing. I noticed it slowly. The black had gone to a deep gray blue, and there was a thin line of lighter gray over Pamlico Sound. That specific color the sky gets maybe 40 minutes before actual sunrise, when it's not dark anymore, but it's not anything else yet either. The shift was almost over. The night was almost over. That was happening whether I was ready for it or not. I got up off the floor. That took a minute. Then I walked to the instrument console. The NOAA radio uplink was still functional. Green status light, solid. The antenna array had been Johnny's last thing. He'd gone down to check it right before everything went sideways. And apparently whatever he'd done down there before the figures got to him, it had been enough. Or the array had been fine the whole time, and he just needed something to do. Either way, the uplink was live. I pulled up the morning broadcast template. It's a standard NOAA format. Barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, sea state, cloud ceiling, any active advisories. I'd filled it out on every shift for 3 years. I knew the order by heart. I could have done it half asleep, which was good, because I was pretty close to that. I read the barometric pressure off the instrument display first, 29.88 inches, steady. I typed it in. Then wind speed. The anemometer on the upper mast was reading 12 knots, direction northeast. I typed that. Cloud ceiling I had to check twice because my eyes weren't focusing right, but it came back consistent. Broken layer at 2,200 feet, another at 4,000. I noted it as partly cloudy in the summary field, which is the correct terminology for that ceiling coverage. I checked the sea state data from the buoy network. Buoy 41025 was transmitting normally again. 4 different readings, cycling through in sequence, the way it was supposed to. I looked at that for a second. Then I moved on. There was a small craft advisory already active through 6 p.m. I confirmed it, didn't modify it. It was accurate. I keyed the mic and read the report out loud. The same words I'd used on every shift, the same format, the same order. Barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, cloud ceiling, sea state, active advisories. I said every word correctly. My voice came out level, which surprised me a little. Small craft advisory remains in effect through 1800 hours. Mariners are advised to use caution in Diamond Shoals and adjacent waters. This is NOAA Weather Radio, Hatteras Island Station. Next scheduled broadcast at 6 a.m. I released the mic key. The console light went from red back to green. I stood there with my right hand on the edge of the console and my left arm at my side, and I thought about Alvin Wallace. He'd been in that closet for I didn't know how long. The notebook went back 11 months. 11 months of documented encounters. 11 months of margin notes. 11 months of frequency tables and buoy footage timestamps and careful, methodical records. He'd known about the siren. He'd known exactly what it did. He'd had the information the whole time. He just hadn't had authorization. He'd been waiting for someone above him in the chain to say, "Go ahead." And that authorization had never come, and he'd ended up wedged behind a battery rack with both eardrums ruptured and the word "open" scratched into the metal shelf so many times the letters had worn down to nothing. I wasn't angry at him. I don't think I had the energy for that. It was more like I understood it. I understood the instinct to wait for someone else to make the call. I'd done it myself with Johnny, hadn't I? Logged the tardiness, decided not to escalate, told myself it wasn't worth ending a 20-year career over one bad night. I'd waited too. I'd just run out of things to wait for a little faster than Alvin had. The difference was, I'd made it to morning. Johnny hadn't. I kept coming back to that in the same flat, factual way you keep coming back to an instrument reading that doesn't make sense. Johnny Barker, 52, 20 years with NOAA, knew more about buoy telemetry than anyone I'd ever worked with. He'd been standing in the surf with a slack jaw and barnacle crust starting at his chin, reaching toward the station pylons. And then the water had come up, and he was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him between the radio going quiet and the moment he appeared at the base of the stairwell. I didn't know if there'd been anything left of him by then, or if the thing walking up the stairs had just been wearing him. I probably wasn't going to know. That part was going to stay open, I figured. Some things do. The shift log was still open on the secondary monitor. The last entry was time-stamped 3:07 a.m. I'd logged the fire alarm trigger, lower deck, 'cause undetermined. That was the last thing I'd written before going through the catwalk hatch. I looked at the cursor blinking in the entry field for a while. I didn't know how to write what came next. I'm not great at writing those kinds of entries on a good day. Incident reports, anomaly logs, anything that requires you to describe something outside the normal parameter range. The format doesn't really have a field for figures on the beach, or coworker lost to the surf, or siren deployment, unauthorized, effective. There wasn't a drop-down for any of it. I left the log where it was, no further entries. Someone else was going to have to figure out the paperwork, and that was fine. That was a problem for daylight. Outside, the gray over Pamlico Sound had gone a little lighter. The water was flat and dark, and the beach below the station was empty. I'd checked it twice already through the east window, sector by sector, north to south, surf line to pylons. Sand. Just sand. The tide was coming in, covering the places where the figures had been, and in another hour or two there wouldn't be any trace of them at all. The water was good at that. I sat down in the console chair, which was more comfortable than the floor, and I put my right hand flat on the desk and I looked at the instrument panel. Everything was reading normal. Pressure steady, wind consistent, uplink green, buoy network nominal. The station was functioning. So was I. That was the thing I'd needed to prove, and the broadcast had proved it. I was still here, still in the station, still capable of reading a barometric pressure off a display and saying the words correctly into a microphone. Alvin Wallace had documented everything and waited for someone to act, and died waiting. I'd acted. The cost was Johnny and the use of my left arm and whatever came next. The report, the questions, the parts of this. I was going to have to say out loud to people who hadn't been here. The sky kept getting lighter. I kept my eyes on the instruments and waited for 6 a.m.